Welcome to Thinking Bedtime, where philosophy and psychology are told slowly and gently. Each video offers a profound perspective, shedding light on philosophical and psychological ideas from cultures around the world. Thank you for listening. If you find the content helpful, please like, share, and subscribe so Thinking Bedtime can continue to be with you. Today, Thinking Bedtime proudly presents to you the complete content on the philosophy of death.
Part 1. Why death is the central question of philosophy. Philosophy is not born from death, but no philosophy matures without it. From the earliest thoughts of human beings capable of reflection, death has been present as an insurmountable limit, an absolute boundary that all reasoning, all systems, all intellectual ambitions must ultimately reach. Therefore, seriously speaking, death is not a subject in philosophy. It is the silent anchor that makes philosophy philosophy, not a technique of argumentation or a game of language. Humans are not the only creatures that die, but they are the only creatures that live with the knowledge that they will die. This difference lies not in physiology, but in the structure of existence. An animal avoids danger to continue living, but it doesn't carry with it in each choice the awareness that its entire life is finite. Humans are different. No matter how much they try to forget, avoid, or conceal it with busyness or belief, death silently shapes all their plans, values, and deepest anxieties. Philosophy emerges precisely at the intersection of consciousness and finitude, where humanity is forced to ask not just how to live, but what does life mean, knowing that we will die. If humans were immortal, most philosophical problems would lose their urgency. Ethics would then become merely a matter of optimizing behavior over an infinite time frame. Choices would no longer be tragic, for every mistake could be rectified by time. Meaning would become diluted, for nothing is impossible to postpone. It is death as the non-negotiable endpoint that gives life form, choice weight, and philosophy a reason to exist. In other words, death does not render life meaningless. It is the condition for life to have meaning. From a very early age, philosophers recognized that to understand death, one must first understand what a human being is. The question, what happens when we die, cannot be answered without clarifying who we are. This is why in the ancient Greek tradition, the problem of death was always linked to the problem of the soul. Plato argued that human beings are essentially souls using the body as a temporary instrument. Death, according to him, is the liberation of the soul from the body, the condition for the soul to return to the world of ideas. In this view, death is not destruction, but transformation, not an end, but a return to the proper order of being. Aristotle was more cautious than Plato, but he did not take the matter lightly. He did not consider the soul to be an independently existing entity, but rather a form of the living body, the principle that makes a body a living being with life, sensation, and reason. For Aristotle, death was the disintegration of this whole, where the body lost its principle of organization. Although he did not affirm the immortality of the soul in the Platonic sense, Aristotle still forced philosophy to confront the fundamental question:
Is death an absolute end, or merely the end of a specific form of existence? From here, philosophy could no longer avoid defining the nature of man, because every conception of death entails a conception of man. One of philosophy's most important contributions to the subject of death is its ability to separate instinctive fear from rational judgment. The fear of death is obvious, but this obviousness is not always philosophically true. Epicurus, one of the most audacious thinkers of antiquity, put forward the shocking argument that death is not a bad thing for the deceased. His reasoning was simple yet incisive. All good and bad are related to sensation. Death is a state of no sensation. Therefore, death cannot be a bad thing for the deceased. When death is present, we are no longer. When we are, death is not yet present.
This argument is not intended to soothe emotions, but to expose a common misconception. We fear death not because death itself is harmful, but because we project the anxieties of a living onto the state of the dead. Epicurus forces philosophy to ask itself, can something bad exist without a subject to experience it? And if not, what is our fear of death directed at? Death itself, or the dying process, or the loss of what we cherished in life? From here, the problem of death expands to a problem of value and meaning. If death is not inherently bad, what is it that haunts humanity so intensely? A crucial answer lies in the fact that death is not merely a future event, but a structural condition of the present. We do not simply die at the end of our lives. We live our entire lives in the shadow of death. It is precisely because we know that time is finite that we are compelled to prioritize, choose, and accept trade-offs. Every yes is also a no. Choosing this path means abandoning countless other paths forever.
Modern philosophers, like Thomas Nagel, have pointed out that what makes death seem frightening is not the state of non-existence, but the deprivation. Death takes away from us the possibilities we could have lived, the experiences we could have had. But this argument also entails a paradox. If every ending is a deprivation, then any limitation is unjust. Bernard Williams, in analyzing the hypothesis of immortality, showed that an infinitely long life not only fails to guarantee meaning, but also risks depleting the very things that make life worth living. A life has meaning not because it lasts, but because it has form, and that form only appears when there is an end. Philosophy, therefore, does not approach death as a problem to be solved, but as a reality to be understood. It does not promise liberation, nor does it lull us into a false sense of hope. What philosophy does, and can only do, is to force people to look directly at the very structure of their existence. We are conscious beings, bound by time, and cannot escape death. In this light, the question is no longer how to avoid dying, but how to live in such a way that death does not turn the entirety of life into a meaningless joke.
Therefore, from Socrates to later philosophers, philosophy has often been described as a preparation for death, not in the sense of practicing for death, but in the sense of practicing to live in awareness of death. Those who understand they will die do not necessarily live more recklessly. On the contrary, they may live more cautiously, more honestly with themselves, and less willing to trade their finite time for false values. This introduction is not intended to conclude, but to lay the groundwork. Death is the central question of philosophy because it forces all other questions to answer more definitively. It strips away the possibility of infinite procrastination, exposes the fragility of all value systems, and at the same time gives life a depth that no immortality can replace. In the following section, we will return to the historical beginnings of this issue, how the ancient Greek philosophers, particularly Plato and Aristotle, developed the first theories of the soul and death, laying the foundation for the entire Western tradition of thought on life and its end.
Part 2. Soul, Body, and Death in Ancient Greek Philosophy, from Plato to Aristotle. If Part 1 explored why death is the central question of philosophy, here we must delve into where that question was first systematically considered. Ancient Greek philosophy did not invent death, but it did something decisive. It transformed death from an instinctive experience into a theoretical problem, forcing humanity to respond with concepts, arguments, and thought structures. At the heart of this endeavor was the concept of the soul, not as an object of worship, but as the key to understanding what man is and what death truly marks. For Plato, death cannot be understood without understanding the soul, and the soul cannot be understood without escaping the intuitive identification of man with the body. In dialogues like Phaedo, Plato approaches death not with fear, but with a radical question. What in man is capable of knowing immutable truth? The body, according to Plato, is constantly changing, subject to sensations, desires, and decay. But true knowledge, knowledge of beauty, goodness, and justice, is universal and unchanging. From this tension, Plato arrives at his famous conclusion. The soul is not identical with the body, and it is the soul that is the true subject of knowledge and moral life.
In this vision, death is not the destruction of man, but the disintegration of an imperfect union between soul and body. The body, in many passages of Plato, is depicted as an obstacle, even a prison, confining the soul to the world of sensation and distracting it from contemplating truth. Death, therefore, can be understood as a liberation, not in the sense of cheap, optimistic sentiment, but in an ontological sense. The soul returns to a state of existence consistent with its nature. This is why Plato could put forward an argument that shocks common intuition. Philosophy is preparation for death, not because the philosopher is weary of life, but because philosophical life is the process of separating the soul from its blind dependence on the body while still alive. The philosopher, according to Plato, does not practice dying, but practices not allowing the body to dominate the soul. Death, in that case, merely completes a process that has already begun. However, Plato's strength is also what makes many later generations wary. If the soul exists independently and the body is merely a temporary tool, what value does earthly life have beyond its role as preparation?
Does this perspective inadvertently diminish the meaning of relationships, actions, and responsibilities in concrete life? It is here that Aristotle enters with a different approach, less metaphysical but no less profound.
Aristotle adopted Plato's problem, but radically changed the way he framed the question. Instead of asking how the soul exists independently, he asked, what is the soul within the structure of a living being? For Aristotle, the soul cannot be understood as a separate object, nor can it be reduced to the body. The soul is the form of the living body, the organizing principle that makes a physical body a living entity with life, sensation, and reason. Without a soul, the body is merely disorganized matter. Without a body, the soul has no place to manifest itself. This understanding has profound implications for the problem of death. For Aristotle, death is not the departure of a complete entity to another world, but the disintegration of a unified whole. When the body is no longer capable of performing its vital functions, the soul, as the principle of those functions, also ceases to exist in the same way. This view allowed Aristotle to avoid some of Plato's difficulties, but at the same time raised a new question. If the soul does not exist independently, what, if anything, remains after death?
Aristotle did not offer a simple answer. He distinguished levels of the soul: the nourishing soul, the sensory soul, and the rational soul. Of these, the rational soul, especially the pure intellect, has characteristics that seem not entirely dependent on the body. However, Aristotle was extremely cautious when speaking of the possibility of immortality for this part. The important thing is not to affirm or deny immortality, but that Aristotle refused to turn death into a comforting myth. For him, philosophy had to be true to the natural structure of man, even if that truth did not bring reassurance. The difference between Plato and Aristotle is not a simple contradiction, but rather two complementary approaches. Plato emphasized the metaphysical dimension and value of the soul. Aristotle emphasized the living unity between soul and body. One viewed death as liberation, the other as the disintegration of a natural whole. But both agreed on a fundamental point. Death cannot be understood without understanding what man is, and man cannot be understood without clarifying the relationship between soul and body. It is on this foundation that the Greek schools after Plato and Aristotle were able to develop different positions on death. Epicurus, for example, would radically reinterpret Aristotle's naturalistic approach in a different way. If the soul is inextricably linked to the body and disintegrates when the body disintegrates, then death cannot be a state of experience. Epicurus's famous argument that death means nothing to us can only be properly understood if we see it as a consequence of a consistent conception of man as a finite entity. Epicurus did not deny the fear of death. He simply argued that this fear was not directed at the right object. It is noteworthy that throughout ancient Greek philosophy, death was rarely seen as an absolute catastrophe. Even when it was viewed as a loss of body, loss of life, loss of possibility, it was not equated with moral evil or cosmic punishment. This serenity did not stem from coldness, but from something deeper. Greek philosophers did not consider man to be the absolute center of the universe. Man is part of a larger natural or rational order, and death is an expression of man's presence within that order. Therefore, death in ancient Greek philosophy did not lead to nihilism, but to a more sober understanding of life. If man is finite, then life must be lived in accordance with those limitations. If the soul is the center of moral and cognitive life, then caring for the soul, through knowledge, temperance, and justice, becomes the core task. And if death is inevitable, then the important thing is not to prolong life at all costs, but to give life a worthy form. Plato and Aristotle, each in their own way, laid the foundation for the entire Western tradition of reflection on death. They did not resolve the issue once and for all, but established the axes of questions that later philosophy could not ignore. What role does the soul play in human identity? What is the value of the body? And does death mark an absolute end or a transformation in the structure of existence? All subsequent debates, from Epicurus to modern philosophers, have directly or indirectly engaged in dialogue with the questions raised here. In conclusion, what remains is not a definitive answer, but a philosophical attitude, daring to look death directly without myth, and daring to think about life without denying its finitude. This very attitude will lead us to the next section, where Epicurus and the ancient materialist tradition will fundamentally challenge the intuition that death is evil, forcing philosophy to make a clear distinction between the fear of the living and the state of the dead. Part 3. Epicurus and the most unstable thesis in the history of philosophy. Death is not a bad thing. In the entire history of Western philosophy, there is rarely a thesis as simple in form and as radical in its consequences as Epicurus's thesis on death. He did not deny that humans fear death, nor did he try to make death beautiful or noble. Epicurus did something far more dangerous. He questioned the very object of fear, and from that forced philosophy to answer a question that most people avoid. Does death actually harm the deceased? Epicurus did not start from mythology, nor from moral intuition, but from a consistent conception of man as a natural whole. According to him, human beings are composed of body and soul, but both are matter. The soul is not an immortal entity existing independently, but a subtle form of matter, inextricably linked to the body and disintegrating with it at death. From this premise, Epicurus arrives at a conclusion that many find cold, even inhuman, but is extremely logically sound. After death, there is no longer a subject to experience anything. From this emerges the central argument. Everything good and bad requires sensation. Death is the complete absence of sensation. Therefore, death
cannot be good or bad for the deceased. While we exist, death is not present. When death is present, we cease to exist. There is no moment in which both appear simultaneously for death to act upon us. The fear of death, according to Epicurus, is therefore a conceptual misconception. We fear a state in which we will no longer be the subject of any state. What makes this argument particularly difficult to accept is not its weakness, but its direct attack on the deepest human intuition. Humans do not merely fear pain or the dying process. They fear non-existence, the loss of the world, the deprivation of all possibilities. Epicurus does not deny this sense of loss in the living, but he asserts that it cannot be attributed to the deceased. The grief of those left behind does not prove that death is a bad thing for the deceased, just as our sadness when a friend leaves a room does not prove that leaving the room is a bad thing for that friend.
Epicurus is often misunderstood as an advocate of indifference, but this understanding is only possible if one does not read him seriously. On the contrary, Epicurus sets a rigorous standard for judging value. Something can only be good or bad if a subject exists to experience it. This standard applies not only to death, but to his entire ethics. Joy, suffering, happiness, or unhappiness are all linked to the state of being alive. When life ends, all these categories cease with it. However, the strength of Epicurus's argument lies precisely in the fact that it encounters the most serious philosophical resistance. One of the most important counter-arguments developed by Thomas Nagel in modern philosophy is that death can be bad not because it causes pain, but because it deprives. According to this argument, something can harm a person even if that person no longer exists to experience the harm. We could say that a person who has been betrayed continues to be treated wrongly after death, even if they don't feel it. Similarly, death can be bad because it cuts off possibilities of life that the person could have had.
Epicurus, if given the chance to respond, would not shy away from this counter-argument. He would emphasize that calling an event depriving implicitly assumes a subject being deprived. But if no subject exists after death, then there is no one to be deprived of anything. The regret for unlived possibilities is the regret of the living, reflecting a state in which ontologically no one is present. In other words, Epicurus forces philosophy to choose, either accept that value is intrinsically linked to experience, or open the door to a concept of subjectless harm, which entails a host of uncontrollable consequences. It is crucial to clarify that Epicurus does not deny that death has meaning for life. He only denies that it has meaning for the deceased. This distinction is often carelessly misinterpreted. Epicurus understood very well that the awareness of death shapes how we live, how we choose, and how we value time. But he argued that precisely because death is not a bad thing for the deceased, the obsession with death is the source of much unnecessary unhappiness in life.
According to Epicurus, human suffering is not due to death itself, but to a mistaken belief about death, the belief that it is punishment, eternal pain, or a loss that can be experienced after death. These beliefs, combined with insatiable desires and fear of the gods, cause people to live in perpetual anxiety. Liberation from the fear of death, therefore, is not the ultimate goal, but a condition for living a peaceful, balanced, and self-controlled life. Lucretius, a student and propagator of Epicurus's thought, offered a particularly sharp image to illustrate this point. Our state after death is no different from our state before death. Before we existed, thousands of years passed without us feeling any absence or harm. So why do we consider the state of non-existence after death to be frightening, while the state of non-existence before death is not? This symmetrical argument is not intended to downplay death, but rather to highlight the inconsistency in how humans distribute fear over time.
However, Epicurus was not the last to have the final say on this matter. Bernard Williams, in his analysis of the hypothesis of immortality, pointed out that while Epicurus might be right in saying that the state of death is harmless, this does not automatically make death neutral with respect to life. If a life is cut short too soon, we still have reason to call it a tragedy, not because the deceased is suffering, but because the form of that life is broken. This point shows that Epicurus may be right at the ontological level, but not sufficiently at the level of evaluating life as a whole. It is here that the problem of death reveals its full complexity. Death may not be bad for the deceased, but it is still regrettable for life as a finite project. These two propositions are not contradictory if we keep the levels of analysis clear. Epicurus compels us to make this distinction seriously, rather than conflating the emotions of the living with the state of the dead. What makes Epicurus still unsettling for modern man is not that he was wrong, but that he did not allow us to cultivate fear as a noble hypocrite. If death is not inherently bad for the dead, then much of our fear of death reflects not profound understanding, but a blind clinging to ourselves. Epicurus did not call for a life of self-indulgence. He called for a life of awareness, understanding the true source of suffering, and not torturing ourselves with fears without an object.
In conclusion, what remains is not a comforting slogan, but a rigorous philosophical challenge. If Epicurus was right, then philosophy must explain why people still fear death even without an ontological reason to do so. If Epicurus was wrong, then philosophy must pinpoint precisely what in death is harmful and terreme. This question cannot be avoided with emotion or sentimental morality. The next phase will continue from this very rift, when death is no longer understood simply as good or bad, but becomes a structural element of the meaning of life. There, modern philosophy will be forced to answer a more difficult question, not is death bad, but whether life still has meaning when we know for certain that it will end. Part 4. Death, the value of life, and the problem of meaning. Finitude is not a flaw. When Epicurus declared that death is not a bad thing for the dead, he diffused a fear, but at the same time left a void. If death does not harm the dead, then what, if anything, makes a life cut short so tragic? Why do we still say that a young death is a pity, that an unfinished life is a loss, even though we don't believe the dead are suffering somewhere? It is in this void that the problem of the meaning of life emerges with all its weight. A common mistake is to assume that the meaning of life must be something that exists independently of death, or even transcends death. According to this line of thinking, if everything ends, then all effort becomes meaningless. But this is a weak argument because it implicitly assumes that only what is eternal has value. Serious philosophy does not readily accept this assumption. On the contrary, many philosophers have pointed out that it is precisely because life is finite that it has a clear value structure, and it is precisely because time is limited that choice is decisive.
Thomas Nagel was the one who sharply re-examined the issue of death in this way. He argued that death can be bad not because it causes pain, but because it deprives a person of the good things they could have experienced. A person who dies at 20, in this view, loses not only existence, but a series of unfulfilled possibilities. The tragedy lies not in the post-mortem state, but in the life that was left unfinished. However, this argument only carries weight if we understand life as a whole with a form, not as a series of disconnected moments. A life can only be called unfinished if we implicitly acknowledge that it has a structure, a direction, a potential for completion. It is here that death is no longer seen as a single event at the end of life, but as an element that shapes the entirety of life from the very beginning. Bernard Williams offered a particularly important analysis when he considered the hypothesis of immortality. The common intuition is that if we lived forever, we would have more opportunities to find meaning. But Williams argued that an infinitely long life not only fails to guarantee meaning, but also risks eroding the very things that make life worth living. Desires, projects, relationships, all have a saturation point. Without limits, they would either become repetitive to the point of boredom or lose the connection that is based on the scarcity of time. The crux of Williams's argument is not that immortality is bad, but that meaning demands form, and form demands an end. A life without an end is not an extended life, but a life stretched indefinitely, where no decision is truly final, and therefore no decision is truly serious. Death, in this light, is not the enemy of meaning, but the condition for meaning to remain undiluted. This forces us to reconsider a very human reflex, the desire for more time. This desire is not wrong in itself, but it often masks a misconception. We think that meaning increases with the amount of time, while in reality, meaning depends on how time is structured. A long life without priorities, without commitment, without self-imposed limits can be far more empty than a short life lived with a clear awareness of what is important.
From this perspective, death emerges not merely as an end, but as a structural pressure forcing humanity to answer the question of value. It is impossible to do everything. It is impossible to live every possible life. Every choice is a permanent renunciation of other possibilities. Without death, this renunciation would always be temporary. With death, it becomes definitive. It is this definitiveness that gives moral and existential choice a weight that no purely value theory can replace. Later existential philosophies, though following very different paths, acknowledge this point. Martin Heidegger, for example, does not view death simply as a biological event, but as the ultimate possibility of humanity, a possibility that cannot be overcome, cannot be transferred, and cannot be indefinitely postponed. In this perspective, the awareness of death does not shrink life, but rather makes it authentic, because people can no longer hide behind social roles or vague plans for an uncertain future.
Jean-Paul Sartre, while disagreeing with Heidegger on many points, also acknowledged that death places limits on all human endeavors. Our projects are only meaningful insofar as they are pursued within a finite lifetime. Without death, freedom would be invisible, for there would be nothing to compel us to decide here and now. Freedom, like meaning, needs a context where hesitation has a real price. It is noteworthy that in all these analyses, death is never seen as a solution to the problem of meaning. Philosophy does not say that because we will die, we must live this way or that way. What it says is, because we will die, we cannot avoid asking ourselves what is worth living for. No universal moral imperative is derived directly from death, but there is an unavoidable requirement, the requirement to take responsibility for how we use our finite time. One of the most dangerous illusions is the belief that meaning must come from outside of life, from the immortality of the soul, from a final judgment, or from the permanent imprint left on history. These sources of meaning, while comforting, often mislead. They cause people to live for an uncertain future, rather than for the true structure of present life. Philosophy, when honest, forces us back to the more difficult question. If there is no guarantee that our lives will be redeemed after death, how should we live now?
Death, in this sense, is the harshest test of all theories of meaning. A life only truly has meaning if it remains standing, even when we know it will end completely. This requires neither epic heroism nor superhuman sacrifice. It demands clarity about what we consider important, clarity about what we are willing to compromise on, and clarity about the limits we cannot cross. In conclusion, it can be said that philosophy does not find meaning in the face of death, but through death. Not by glorifying finitude, but by acknowledging it as an inseparable condition of human life. A meaningful life is not the longest nor the safest, but the life lived with the awareness that it will not last forever. The next section will delve into the psychological, philosophical aspect of the issue. What does the fear of death truly aim at? Do we fear pain, nothingness, or the fear that we have lived wrongly before it is too late? It is there that philosophy will have to directly engage in dialogue with what people often refuse to acknowledge about themselves.
Part 5. The fear of death, fear of pain, fear of nothingness, or fear of a wasted life. If we had to choose a point where modern philosophy is most intensely confronted with death, it would no longer be the question of what is death in an ontological sense, but rather the question of whether death gives life meaning. Here, Death is no longer merely a biological end or the separation of soul and body, but becomes a silent force compelling the entire human life to justify itself. Those who think that modern philosophy has overcome the obsession with death are mistaken. In fact, it has gone deeper, no longer asking how we die, but what we live for when we know for sure that we will die. Thomas Nagel is one of those who sharply re-examined this question. When he analyzed death as something evil, he did not speak in the language of emotion, but in terms of the structure of values. Nagel's argument is not based on the pain of death, nor on the post-mortem state, but on deprivation. Death is bad because it deprives a person of the possibilities that they could have lived, experienced, and accomplished. Even if the deceased no longer has the consciousness to feel lost, from the perspective of life as a whole, death is still a real loss. Here, Nagel places a landmine right under Epicurus's foot. If Epicurus said, "While we are alive, death has not come. When death comes, we are no more," Nagel responds, "The point is not in the moment of death, but in the entirety of life that is cut short."
But this very argument opens up another, more dangerous problem. If death is bad because it ends life, then wouldn't extending life indefinitely be absolutely good? This is where Bernard Williams enters with one of the most haunting analyses of the 20th century. Williams imagines an immortal being living forever, with continuous memory, personality, and consciousness. Initially, immortality seems like a gift. Every project has a time limit. Every aspiration has a chance of fulfillment. But further on, Williams reveals a paradox. Either the being will exhaust all meaningful desires, or will transform to the point of no longer being oneself. An infinitely long life, if it retains its original identity, will become unbearably boring. If it constantly changes to avoid boredom, the original self will vanish. Immortality, therefore, is not a victory over death, but a trade-off between death and another form of emptiness. Here, death is unexpectedly restored in value. It is no longer merely the enemy of life, but the limiting condition that gives life its form. Without death, all choices lose their weight. Without death, urgency disappears, and with it, meaning. Williams does not glorify death, but he forces us to acknowledge that it is precisely finitude that makes life human, not that of a timelessly drifting entity. Martin Heidegger goes further, and to some extent, more ruthlessly. For him, death is not an event that will occur at the end of life, but the fundamental structure of human existence. Man, according to Heidegger, is a being who always lives in relation to his own death. Not the death of others, not death as a biological fact, but my own death, which no one can replace. Because no one can die in my place, death becomes the most radical experience of individuality. From this, Heidegger speaks of facing death as an attitude towards life, not to be pessimistic, but to live authentically. When people avoid death, they hide in anonymous norms, borrowed values, goals that everyone else pursues. When confronted with death, they are forced to ask themselves, if my time is finite, what is truly worth living for? It is noteworthy that in the works of Nagel, Williams, and Heidegger,
Death is no longer an object of comfort or solace. None of them say don't fear death in a cheap, moralistic sense. On the contrary, they show that the fear of death is a sign of a deeper problem. A problem of values, of the project of life, of personal identity. The fear of death is not just because of pain or loss, but because we are not sure if we have lived rightly, lived fully, or lived truly as ourselves.
Here, modern philosophy is distinctly separate from the classical religious tradition. Plato might place his hope in the immortality of the soul. Aristotle might view death as the natural end of active life. Epicurus might attempt to dispel fear with logical reasoning. But modern philosophy, especially since the 20th century, no longer easily offers humanity a metaphysical escape. It forces us to live with death rather than overcome it through faith or denial. This leads to an unpleasant consequence. If death cannot be eliminated and immortality is not the solution, then the meaning of life cannot be postponed. We cannot say, I can live later, or it's not too late to think about it when I'm old. The very finitude of life makes any postponement dangerous. Every choice is an exclusion. Choosing one means abandoning another, and time is irreversible. One of the most common illusions of modern man is the belief that we have more time than we think. The philosophy of death, if it fulfills its proper function, must shatter this illusion.
Not to drive people to despair, but to hold them accountable for how they live. Heidegger calls this pulling people out of an anonymous existence. Williams shows the emptiness of an infinitely long life. Nagel reminds us that death cuts off possibilities before they can even materialize. 3 different approaches, but all pointing to one point. Life has value not because it is long, but because of how it is lived within its limits. At this stage, philosophy no longer speaks for man, but places man before a mirror. It doesn't answer the question, how should I live, but makes it impossible to avoid that question. Death, therefore, is not a destroyer of meaning, but the ultimate test of meaning. If a life cannot bear the gaze of death, then the problem lies not with death, but with that life. At this stage, philosophy of death does not aim to teach us to die without fear, but to teach us to live in such a way that death does not become an accusation. And it is at this point that death is no longer at the end of the road, but stands right in the middle of life, silently but inescapably.
Part 6. To put it bluntly, the entire history of philosophy concerning death ultimately aims not at explaining death itself, but at explaining humanity's awareness of its impending death. Death is inherently silent. It does not argue, justify, or demand anything. It is humanity, upon becoming aware of its finitude, that transforms death into a philosophical problem. And it is here that we arrive at the final question. Does philosophy truly help humanity confront death, or is it merely a subtle way to delay the truth? Socrates, in his moments before death, did not argue for a longer life, but for a proper death. This is not an epic opera, but a philosophical declaration. The way we die reflects the way we have lived. Socrates' death is not significant because it is noble, but because it is consistent. He did not deny what he believed, did not bargain with truth, and did not ask for an exception for himself. Here, death is not a tragedy, but the ultimate test of philosophical life.
But not every life can end in that way. Most people die in silence, in illness, in accidents, or in the gradual disintegration of consciousness. Philosophy cannot romanticize this reality. Therefore, the more important question is not, does death have meaning, but whether an ordinary life, without heroism or greatness, can withstand the truth of death. Arthur Schopenhauer looked directly at this point with cold pessimism. For him, death exposes the meaninglessness of all personal desires. The will to live drives people to survive, to struggle, to love, to hate, but ultimately all is erased. However, it is noteworthy that Schopenhauer did not see death as an enemy, but as liberation from the endless game of desires. Here, death does not bring meaning, but liberates man from the illusion of meaning. Despite many opposing this view, it raises an unavoidable question. Is meaning something we discover or something we invent to cope with finitude? Friedrich Nietzsche reacted vehemently to that view. For him, the issue wasn't that death destroys meaning, but that humanity has become too insignificant in the face of death. Nietzsche didn't seek to console people before the end, but challenged them to live in such a way that they could say yes to their entire life, including its death. The idea of eternal repetition wasn't a cosmological hypothesis, but a moral test. If we had to live this life an infinite number of times, would we accept it? If the answer is no, then the problem lies not in death, but in how we are living. At this point, philosophy is forced to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. No doctrine can replace life. No logical argument makes death satisfying. No metaphysical system guarantees that each individual's life has objective meaning. Philosophy does not save humanity from death. It can only save them from dying in a mental slumber.
Jean-Paul Sartre arrives at this conclusion without compromise. For him, death does not give life a complete meaning. On the contrary, it freezes all possibilities and turns life into a finished event. Meaning does not come from death, but from the choices made while alive. But precisely because of this, man has no support other than himself. No God, no predetermined nature, no final promise. Death only confirms one thing. We are entirely responsible for our lives, and there is no second draft. Here, philosophy reaches its limit. It cannot say anything more beautiful. But this silence is the most honest. Death does not demand that we understand it, but that we confront the truth that we cannot live as if we were immortal. Looking back at the entire intellectual journey from Plato to Heidegger, from Epicurus to Nagel, we see a common thread running through it. Philosophy constantly strives to place death in its proper place.
neither exaggeration nor denial, neither turning it into an absolute terror nor a trivial detail. Death is the ultimate limit, and every serious thought must measure itself against that limit.
The most dangerous thing is not the fear of death, but living as if death has nothing to do with oneself. This is the most common mental ailment of modern man. Procrastination, distraction, and self-soothing with borrowed goals. Philosophy of death, if it still has value, must break this state, not with a scream, but with clear awareness. Therefore, the only acceptable conclusion is not an answer, but an attitude. Death does not give us meaning. It demands that we create meaning while we are alive. It does not automatically make life more noble. It forces us to decide whether our lives are worthy of that inevitable end.
A good life in the light of death is not a perfect life, nor a long life. It is a life that does not lie to itself, does not evade its limitations, does not wait for another time to live authentically. When death comes, it does not need to be welcomed, nor does it need to be cursed. It only needs to be faced directly. And if philosophy has one final task, it is not to teach people how to die, but to help them live in such a way that when death comes, it does not turn their entire lives into a belated question.